classifications. Domestic debt usually refers to debt instruments issued under the local law. As I said, the two classifications are local law, local currency debt, which we know as treasury bills and treasury bonds. And then the second classification is local law, foreign currency debt, which is SLDBs and foreign currency bank loans of government and SOEs. Then what about the restructuring part, the R? IMF defines restructuring as changes to contractual payment terms, which we'll look at shortly. And also the other interesting part is that change will be detriment to the creditor. That means there will be some kind of a loss or a pain that the creditor needs to bear. Then what are those contractual payment terms? First one is face value. In treasury bills and treasury bonds, face value means the amount that is paid at maturity. And the maturity date means the date which this face value is returned or paid to the customer. And finally, we know treasury bonds carry interim cash flows, which we call coupons. The coupon is consisting of three components: the coupon rate, the coupon frequency, and the date on which the coupons are paid. And the coupon amount is an equation of face value multiplied by coupon rate and divided by coupon frequency. So these are the three contractual payment terms. So that means DDR will affect one or more of these terms. I have taken a small example. We are looking at a treasury bond, a face value of 100, maturing in November 2024 with a coupon rate of 22%. Like any other treasury bond in Sri Lanka, the coupon payment frequency is semi-annual. That means there are two payments within a year. The payments are on 15th May and 15th November. The usual cash flow looks like this. So the coupon is 11 rupees. How we arrived at there? Face value is 100 multiplied by 22% coupon rate, 2 payments per year, so divided by 2, which is equal to 11 rupees. So there are 4 coupons of 11 rupees each, payable on May and November 2023, and finally May and November 2024. The face value or the maturity value is paid on the maturity date, which is 15th November 2024. So let's look at how a hypothetical DDR can affect this. First one is what we call a coupon cut. So a coupon cut means the coupon amount is reduced. So let's assume hypothetically there's a 50% coupon cut. So earlier the coupon was 11 rupees. A 50% deduction means 550. So still we are getting 4 coupons. Still we are getting coupons on those original 4 dates. And still we are getting the original face value of 100. That has not changed. And what has changed is the coupon amount has reduced from 11 to 550. The next one is maturity extension, or in simple terms, it's an extension of maturity. Here, the coupon amounts are same. Coupon dates are also same in terms of month and the date, but the year is extended into the future. For example, if it is a maturity extension of 5 years, rather than 2024 May, it will go up to 2029 May. So if it is a maturity extension of X years, it will be 24 plus X year it matures. Usually in a maturity extension, theoretically, the coupons are paid. In our example, we have assumed the same coupon is paid on same coupon payment dates. That's about maturity extension. The next or more dangerous type is called haircut. It's not the one we take at the barber, but something similar to that. So we have assumed a 20% haircut. What happens here? First difference that we can note is that in all other examples, the first and the second one, we got 100 rupees as maturity value, or what I call face value. Here, what we are getting is only 80. That is what literally haircut means. A 20% haircut on 100 rupee face value means 100 minus 20 becomes 80. The coupon payments dates are same, but something that we all forget is that when the face value is reduced, I remember I told that coupon is linked to the face value because coupon is equal to face value into coupon rate divided by frequency. So when the face value is reduced due to haircut, the coupon amount also automatically reduces. The face value has reduced by 20%. The coupon has also reduced by 20% to 880. What can actually happen will not be 1, 2, or 3, because real world, just like in the real challenges that we face in life, is complicated. So what can actually happen is a combination of 1, 2, or 3, or all 3 together. Few things that we should look at when we are talking about restructuring. First is that maturity extensions usually comes with a coupon cut. If we think why, it's because in our example, we had a 22% coupon rate. If we extend that 2024 bond into 10 years, let's say hypothetically 2034, the government needs to keep paying that 22% coupon for those 10 years as well. So if the coupon rates are high, just like in our example, it becomes very expensive for the government to keep servicing those coupons for a longer period of time. So usually what we have seen is, if there's a maturity extension, it will not be at the original rates, it will be at a lower rate. Then if we look at the second option, which we saw earlier, second point is that if there's a haircut, automatically it leads to a coupon cut as well. Any combination of 1 or 2 or 3 eventually leads to a loss, which we call NPV loss, the time value loss to the investor. That's the total, or that's the whole point of doing a debt restructuring, because we are trying to give some relief. Not we are trying to give, the government is trying to take some relief to them. So eventually that becomes a loss to the investor. So the investors or creditors' first preference is not to restructure or avoidance. But if we are to restructure, the preference is not very clear. We can't say one group of people would prefer a haircut, whereas another group of people will not prefer. It depends on the circumstances and maybe the underlying liabilities of the investor. For example, someone like a foreign investor, maybe they would rather prefer a haircut so that they can take out their investment as soon as possible. They would like to take the pain now and pull back their money as soon as possible. But someone like a long-term investor may rather avoid a haircut because it realizes an immediate loss, and may be happy with a maturity extension with a lower coupon rate, assuming there are no other options available. So these are some few points that we need to think and remember when we talk about how domestic debt restructuring can happen. So we have looked at what DDR is. Now we have to look at why DDR is here. Obviously, it's because of the heavy debt burden of the government. So DDR is trying to provide some relief to the government, individuals, and hopefully to the economy. Just a glimpse from the past. In March 2022, IMF declared that Sri Lanka's government debt is unsustainable. The public debt was classified as unsustainable. Then
okay.
IMF articles prevents them lending to a country where the debt has been classified as unsustainable. So that's why before we got the board approval from the IMF, we had to obtain something called financing assurances from our creditors, because that's one of the conditions before disbursing IMF funds. Now, the public debt is unsustainable, but we are now in the path of the IMF program. So now one of those objectives of this program is to restore debt sustainability. So external creditors, they have to provide significant relief, or they have to occur significant losses, but it's not only external. I believe domestic investors also will have to go through some kind of a pain, because if you look at our public debt, which is rupee denominated, looking at the size or the debt pile as well as cost, I'm referring to the average interest rate, which is around 10%, which is the interest rate applicable for the entire debt portfolio. The debt portfolio keeps snowballing at very high rates, because the incremental rates now, today also the treasury bill auction 3 months was around 26%. So this maturing debt gets repriced at very high levels. So it's like a snowballing effect on the rupee debt, which means that without some kind of a treatment, reaching debt sustainability purely by way of restructuring external debt is almost impossible. Another buzzword, which is called GFNs, or gross financing needs. So what gross financing needs are? Usually it refers to rollover risk of public debt. And if we want to look at a formula, we can simply say GFN is equal to new borrowing plus whatever the borrowings that we did in the past, but mature in a given year, which we have to reborrow. Or in simple terms, it's the total borrowing requirement of the government for a given year. We used to look at net financing needs because earlier we were worried only about financing the net amount or the difference for a given year. But since our debt is now classified as unsustainable, we have to look at not the net, but the gross financing needs or the full quantum of borrowings needed for a year. Now, why are we talking about GFNs? Why GFNs matter? One reason is that in the IMF program, under the debt restructuring, there are certain 4 objectives or targets. 2 out of those 4 relates to GFNs. The first one is that for a given year, average GFN is capped at 13% of the GDP. Or in English, this means the government, the maximum they can borrow to finance their operations and to repay debt is capped at 13% of the GDP. And then there's another challenge. Foreign currency borrowings is capped at 4.5% of the GDP. So these 2 things together is setting a boundary where the borrowing plus new borrowing, or simply the gross financing needs, are capped at 2 levels, 13% for total and 4.5% roughly for foreign. So where we are now? Now we know from 27 to 32, GFNs are capped at 13%. So where we are now right now, is it 30? Is it 13? Is it 15? Is it 30? No, we are much higher. This is actually a slide from the government's investor presentation back in March. So there, as of 2023, our GFN is, the estimated GFN is roughly around 35% levels, which is highlighted in this red box. If you look at 2027 to 2032, still without any restructuring of debt, the GFN is close to 20%, which is way above IMF targets. This implies that some kind of a restructuring doesn't have to be domestic, but some kind of a restructuring has to be done to bring the GFNs down to more sustainable levels. So now we know what DDR is, why DDR is needed. So let's look at who and how we will be impacted. As per the IMF program, which was approved by the IMF board, the government of Sri Lanka is expecting a 75% debt reduction, which is roughly works out to something like 17 billion US dollars. This is not a debt write down or a relief, it's rather a reprofiling of debt, a change or shift of cash flows, or simply we call a moratorium, or maybe a combination of the 2. So I'll, in the interest of time, I'll skip these 2 slides, but I'll introduce a set of people called ISB holders. These are investors who has bought Sri Lanka International Sovereign Bonds, or ISB for short. So this group of people, they have, including arrears, close to 13 billion outstanding with them. If we look at the total, what this means is that if we go back, the total debt service requirement is 21.9 billion. Out of this 21.9 billion, roughly 13 billion is held or to a group of people called ISB holders from different countries. Now, how do they stand compared to others? If you think ISB holders as a country, they hold more debt of Sri Lanka than China, Japan, and India combined. So they hold more debt than all those 3 countries combined. If you look at development agencies, because in the chart you will see ADB is the number 2 creditor of Sri Lanka. So if you look at ADB plus World Bank, the debt held by ISB holders are 139% of that. So the message is that these are private investors, fund managers who have invested in Sri Lanka, and they have a significant leverage or power at the debt restructuring tables. So if they are to take a hit, if they are to take a haircut, if they are to take a loss, then put yourself in their shoes and say what they will ask for. Most likely a DDR. Yes, debt restructuring is complicated. For you and me also it's complicated. It's more complicated for Central Bank and Government of Sri Lanka. So what we know about DDR, what are the views of the government and Central Bank of Sri Lanka? This is a answer provided at the Q&A session of that same presentation made in March 2023 for the creditors. So the message is that if you look at the bottom, the highlighted two sentences, the message the government is saying is that DDR is looked at a method of sharing burden fairly between two types of creditors, which is external creditors and domestic or internal creditors. In other words, what we are trying to do under DDR is that we need to bear a pain, but that pain cannot be borne alone by external creditors. Part of that needs to come back to domestic creditors as well, which means you and I. So let's look at how is domestic debt. I referred earlier to the clarification, and the classification, local law, local currency debt is classified. Treasury bills, roughly 63% is held by Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Then another 18% is by bank and finance companies. But if you look at the treasury bonds, the picture is very much different. Central Bank holds only like less than 1%. Roughly 44% is held by banks and finance companies, but the bigger chunk is held by what this classification says as non-deposit taking institutions. It mainly refers to EPF and ETF. And in addition to that, it includes insurance companies and other funds as well. So in terms of treasury bills, clearly it's the central bank which is holding almost 2/3 of that. But when it comes to treasury bonds, the picture is slightly different. So let's look at where a DDR has happened and how it has ended up, because always we can learn from past. There's a saying that history never repeats, but it often rhymes. So let's see how it has happened. The most recent and relevant example is Ghana, which went through, actually they are going through the DDR process. So the timeline is they announced what they call Domestic Debt Exchange Program, DDEP, in November 2022. They entered, just like us, to a staff level agreement with IMF in December 2022. The interesting part is that the original deadline for DDEP for the agreement with the creditors was December 2022. But they had to extend this deadline by 5 times because there were some subsequent discussions and iterations between the creditors. And finally, in February this year, they announced that they have reached an 85% subscription rate. There are some stories saying that they have changed the base or the eligible bonds so that the subscription rate has increased, but eventually they have received something compared to their original version. So what were the concerns of the investors or bondholders? The first one was that based on the initial terms, the initial announcement, some investors estimated they might lose up to 88% of their original investment. And the original version did not have any coupon payments in 2023, which was a big impact to insurers and banks. So what Ghana did, they followed a carrot and stick approach. So what they did was that originally there were no coupon payments planned for 2023, but they agreed for 5%. And all other bonds, which is 2024 and beyond, they agreed for a relatively higher coupon rate of 9%. And it was told that pension funds and individuals, they were offered much better terms, but interestingly, most have not taken up those offers and they have decided to keep the old bonds. In domestic debt exchange program, just to set some context, what happens is that in any restructuring, there will be a new set of bonds which is created and issued. And investors who are participating in this program, they have to give away their old bonds and accept the new ones. So in this case, pension funds and individuals, they have decided to stick to the old bonds. Then the stick was that to motivate or persuade banks to accept, what they did was those old bonds, which was originally risk weighted at 0%, they increased the risk weight to 100%. So that's a big impact for a regulatory agent. That's a big impact for any organization that is regulated, because it has a big impact on their capital. But the new bonds were rated back at 0%. So that gives a huge incentive for the banks to exchange. And they are setting up a 1.3 billion financial stability fund. World Bank is infusing $250 million, but the rest is not very clear. This is to provide liquidity for banks. But the condition is that if you want to access this fund, if you want to access this liquidity, you have to participate in the debt restructuring process. So there are some significant incentives for organizations to do so. So that's about Ghana. So what we know about Sri Lanka. So the IMF said back in March, a select pool of domestic debt is assumed to be reprofiled. Reprofiled in investment context means usually an extension of maturity, but we should remember from my previous slide that if there's an extension of maturity, usually it comes with a change in coupon rates. In addition to that, what they said for external private debt, which is mostly ISB holders, which I mentioned earlier, a principal reduction is assumed. So now you have to go back to that slide. Principal reduction means simply an haircut. And for bilateral debt, it's a very long maturity extension. They are looking at payments starting in 10 years, 2033. So that's kind of like a moratorium for 10 years. And one point that we should remember is that we try to link IMF and DDR together. But what we should understand is that IMF is showing us the path to debt sustainability. Why? Because our debt is right now unsustainable. But which path to take and at which speed to go is up to the government. So they clearly said that deciding on the debt restructuring perimeter. Debt restructuring perimeter means what debt will be restructured, what type of debts will be included, and what type of debts excluded. Those decisions are sovereign decisions. Or in Sri Lankan context, those decisions are up to the government, not the IMF. So if a certain group of people are excluded from DDR, that's not the decision of IMF, that's the decision of the government itself. So this is the exact slide that this is the best information we know up to now, published information. I'll just summarize this in the next slide. So what's happening in terms of Sri Lankan securities or local government securities is that treasury bills are not restructured, except the ones held by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, which is as of now, end of year, it was something like 62%. But as of the latest figures, because Central Bank has been selling down their stock, it's about 52% of the total government's total treasury bills in issue. Treasury bonds, unfortunately, are being restructured. But what's interesting is those two words, it's a voluntary operation without caution. So Ghana said DDEP, Domestic Debt Exchange Program. So Sri Lanka has come up with DDO, which is Domestic Debt Optimization. It's supposed to be voluntary. So then the next obvious question most asked is that how can I insulate myself from a DDR? How can I shield myself from a DDR? My simple answer is you can't. But what we can do is that we can try to understand it so that we can plan around DDR such that our impact is minimized. Same as insurance. You can't change the probability of an outcome. But what we can do is that we can manage that risk such that the financial risk or financial impact is minimized. Same goes for DDR as well. So last but not least, when can we expect to see some light at the end of the tunnel? Again, this is a slide from the investor presentation. If you look at the DDR for the roadmap for DDR, the finalized DDR proposal was supposed to be presented by end of April, but then the government said they need 1 month more. So the deadline is end of May, which is today. But yesterday there was a news. We haven't seen the details yet, but I think the cabinet spokesperson has announced that government is coming up with this proposal in couple of weeks. So couple is a tricky number. I leave that for you to estimate, but that's what we know right now. And in terms of reading between the lines, I mean, when I was preparing this presentation, I noticed something really interesting. If you look at number 3, which is the engagement with external creditors, there are 3 phases: technical discussion, negotiation, and implementation. Negotiation is given about roughly 3 months. If you focus on number 2, which is us, the domestic creditors engagement, there are only 2 phases. What's missing is the negotiation phase. So the obvious question is, aren't there any negotiations about DDR? So there are 2 schools of thought. First one is that if DDR is purely voluntary, no negotiations are needed. Why? You look at the proposal. If you like it, you accept it. If you don't like it, you can reject it, because that's what voluntary means. The second school of thought is that there is no negotiation is needed, because if the answer is only one rather than option, then no need for negotiation. So, I mean, I let it for you to decide which one of those schools of thoughts may be applicable. But based on this timeline, there's no negotiation phase, just an assessment phase of the impact, which they have done with the banks, and then finally the implementation phase. So hopefully, based on information we know now, we should hear from the government in a couple of weeks about what is the proposed detailed DDR strategy is. But what we should remember is, in Ghana's example, it was supposed to be concluded by December, but it went up to March. Sri Lanka, hopefully maybe less, or hopefully maybe more. But just to run through a small analysis I did back in April, I wrote in LinkedIn also about this. In the interest of time, I'll just jump to the conclusions. Based on my simplified analysis, an extension of maturity is required for all treasury bonds, because the government has already said treasury bills are not restructured, but the treasury bills held by the central bank is restructured. So what we are left is only with the bonds. There are certain opinions floating saying that only medium-term or long-term bonds will be restructured. Based on my numbers, no, because the short-term bonds, when they mature, they will be rolled over into medium and long-term bonds, therefore adding on to those GFNs in 27 to 32. So in my opinion, in my personal opinion, if there is a maturity extension, it's most likely it will be for all bonds rather than a set of selected bonds. Then one final point to clarify. DDR is a zero-sum game. The NPV relief to the debtor, which is the government, is equal to the NPV loss of the creditor, which is the investor. So few things in that context is that government is yet to announce their DDR strategy, hopefully in a couple of weeks, but that may be just the first cut, and the first cut may not be the last. For example, Ghana, they went through 6 iterations. And also, since this relief is a loss to the creditor or the investor, the government and the IMF will ensure that we be fair to each and every creditor. So inter-creditor fairness means, for example, you have to be fair by external creditors versus domestic creditors. And also within a selected group, you have to be fair within that group. If we take domestic creditors, for example, you have to be fair within that chunk of individuals, for example, between banks versus insurance. You can't put a huge amount of pain in one selected category. It has to be fair. And also, if we rewind ourselves back to those 3 restructuring methods, coupon cut, haircut, and maturity extension, I mentioned that different creditors prefer different options. So the government will have to give a menu of options so that the investors can prefer what suits them most. For example, in case of insurance companies, they can select what suits them most in terms of their ALM and solvency positions. And finally, what we should understand is that DDR is like a pie. Debt restructuring is like a pie. DDR is one component. External restructuring is another component. What remains, we know the size of the pie. We saw it earlier, the debt relief is 17 billion US dollars. So what remains is that how to slice this pie. So when we slice this pie of debt relief or pain, we have to ensure that we have to be fair by each type of creditor and for a given set of creditors within the creditors in that category as well. So what remains is how we are going to slice this pie. Some other challenges, especially in our industry context and banks, there needs to be some regulatory forbearance because DDR eventually impacts the cash flows. It might impact the amount of the cash flow and it might impact the timing of the cash flow, or most likely in our case, both. So then we had to look at the impact on solvency, and also because it's cash flows, liquidity, and the regulators will have to provide some relief until the institutions comes back to the normal levels. And then the flip side of that is financial reporting. There's this concept called day one loss. If you look at my example on this, the restructuring, original example had 11 rupee coupons, 4 of them, plus 100 rupee face value. Imagine the example of 20% haircut. So there were not 11 rupee 4 coupons, it was 880. And finally, the face value was also 80. So if you calculate the net present value of all that, the day the debt restructuring or the exchange of securities happens, you had one set of cash flows and instrument, and you are giving it away, and you are getting back another set of cash flows, a lesser set of cash flows with a different instrument. So the NPV of these two needs to be recognized in your financial statements. Of course, I'm not a chartered accountant, but experts will have to agree on a way where this impact, which is called day one impact, is spread over a certain period. That's how it has happened in the other countries. Hopefully, Sri Lanka, with our experts, they will come up with something called maybe a statement of ordinary treatment to account for this day one loss. And then, as I said, that pie, that restructuring pie, is a matter of sharing burden. But this burden should not affect financial system stability, because if financial system stability is affected, I mean, there's no point talking about anything else. We would have seen in the US also, there were some regional banks collapsing and the Fed stepped in because the financial system stability is the most important. Actually, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, they have only 2 objectives based on the current act. One of that is maintaining financial system stability. And then hand in hand, it goes with public confidence. And finally, 2 other factors. If we look at any rating announcement made by Fitch recently, in rating sensitivities, they mention if domestic debt is restructured, it will lead to a downgrade of ratings. They are not referring to our foreign currency IDR because it's already low at RD, but they are referring to our local currency issuer default rating. So if there is a restructuring of payment terms, it will definitely lead to a restructuring, recalibration of credit ratings. And finally, what would that impact have, this DDR impact, on market liquidity and price discovery? For example, you would have noticed central bank has not issued any treasury bond. They have not conducted any treasury bond auction after mid-March. So then the entire burden is now taken by treasury bills. That may be one reason. There may be other, but there may be one reason the treasury bill rates are relatively at same level, so trying to spike. So then this affects the liquidity of the market because there is a huge amount of government securities being issued to fund. And also it affects the market prices or the price discovery, and it affects valuations, cost of capital calculations, because the government security rates and also zero coupon rates as well. So because government security rates is the bedrock of all valuation. So there are, I mean, indirect impacts which we don't see in DDR as well, like that. And then the most important question, I think, for me, the only question I need to ask myself is this DDR, obviously it's the first one, but is it the last? Why? This is a research done sometime in the past, and Verite research picked it up. What they show is that average, given it's a conditional probability, given that a country has defaulted, the number of restructuring deals or episodes on average is 2. In English, that means if a country goes to restructure their debt and they are in default, usually they have, on average, they have to do 2 times. So this chart shows the blue line is the countries that has defaulted and the default period. The red dots show how many times the restructuring deals occurred. So there are many, but when you calculate the average, it comes down to something like 2. So the question is, are we in the first as well as last debt restructuring episode, or are there more to come? Because that will affect the confidence of the investors as well. So this is just for fun. I mean, I leave it to you to decide where Sri Lanka is. Is it the tiger, the lion, or the boy, or the python? It's up, or maybe the crows. And I always like to leave everything on a positive note. So what I have seen, I come from a treasury background. What I have seen is that usually pessimists are often right. But in our field, at least, it's the optimists who are wealthy. So I would like to invite you to follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn, because most of this stuff which I have used in this presentation is from my posts in the past. I'm quite active on LinkedIn and Twitter. I invite you to follow me so that I always try to simplify things so that you can digest it better. So a kind invitation to follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Actuarial Association of Sri Lanka, especially Turanga and Nali, for this opportunity to share my perspectives. Thank you very much. And I pass it back to Turanga. Over to you.